Okay, welcome back to part 2 of our Chapter 5 lecture on terrorist organizations and structures. Now, we left off talking about the different types of cells, and more specifically, we ended talking about fundraising cells. So I wanted to take just a minute to finish up this part before we move on. So one of the types of cells is a fundraising cell. And this cell basically commits illegal acts to raise funds for the organization. And they commit crimes such as kidnappings, weapons and drug trafficking. They're also involved in bogus charities, extortion, pirating of music, and different types of criminal activity. And basically what it's called is a hawala. And here's kind of a chart that shows you a little bit more on hawala. Now, you know, hawala is kind of an interesting thing. The term hawala, you may have heard on that terrorism show if you watch it, Jack Ryan, or you may have caught it a few times while watching the House Financial Services Committee's report, or the subcommittee report on terrorism and finance, if by chance you listen to that kind of stuff. But basically, hawala is a trust-based informal value transfer system. Sometimes it's referred to as parallel banking, and it's used in different places. And there are some times where it is legitimate. So again, there are legitimate purposes across the parts of South Asia, West Africa, and the Middle East, and for facilitating transactions between communities there and people in other parts of the world, like Europe and North America. But it's also attracted the attention of money launderers and terrorists because of the difficulty in being able to track and trace the transactions. There's really no paperwork, and the limited means of regulatory enforcement. So, you know, hawala is kind of an informal structure that makes it easy, or, you know, it's an effective way to transfer money quickly, and on occasion illegally. Now, the key to hawala is that money is transferred but not moved. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy, and I'm not going to go through this entire chart. You can look at the rest of it, at your leisure. But there's a big component of trust in here. But take a look at it. I think you'll find it interesting on how it works. Okay, so now we're going to move from the different cell models. We talked about the different cell organizational models. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the networks, the communication part of these organizational models. So the most important advantage of networks is that they are resilient against disruption and also attacks. They are also effective in repairing damage to them and are highly effective in processing communication. And we talked about the importance of communication. So cells themselves are building blocks of network models that are basically put together. And we're going to talk about a couple of different organizational network models. We're going to talk about the chain model, the hub or the star model, the wheel model, and then the all channel model. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So the chain network model, it's the simplest. And this is where couriers pass information, material, and documents to the next courier. And they use what they call a dead drop. This is a secret place where paperwork or a package or information is left, and it is retrieved later. Now, sometimes they'll do a face-to-face handoff, but typically it doesn't work that way. Typically, there's going to be this dead drop in order to keep kind of a gap between the two individuals that are making the drop. Now, it is possible to disrupt the chain by arresting one of the members, but replacements are then brought in and that chain network kind of continues. So unless unless one courier runs a surveillance on the dead drop, the actual identity of the retrieving courier is unknown to that person who placed the material there in the first place. Does that make sense? So they don't know each other. And as I said, it may be possible to, take out a few couriers in the chain, but it's going to be more difficult to kind of roll up the entire network. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So this is what a chain network looks like. And it's going to be basically from person A, they'll take it to location B and they'll drop it in a dead drop, and then this courier picks it up and brings it here, here, here. And if this person gets caught, these people don't know each other, so this part of the chain is not disrupted. They just simply put in another person here. So hopefully that makes sense. So the simplest network organizational model is going to be the chain network. Next, we have the hub or the star network. So in a terrorist hub or star network, the central hub, the person in the middle, may be a local operational commander. It could be the ideological leader or some other figurehead. Now, in contrast, those outer nodes or those people are more expendable members, like fighters, those who are considered to be less critical to that terrorist movement. Now, the lines between those people or those nodes in a cell are called links or edges, and they represent a communication channel between the nodes and the hub. So hopefully that kind of makes sense to everybody. So when we look at those. Now, members of the network don't often know about each other, and we're still talking about the hub or the star network. And this creates a high level of compartmentalization, because it keeps all the information kind of, protected, if you will, because they don't know each other. So again, the leader's in the middle. And this type of network, it aids in the secrecy, and it also promotes the following of orders. And then the disadvantage, though, is if the leader in the middle is caught, then the network can break down unless there's some type of replacement protocol for the person in the middle. So here's what a hub or a star network looks like. And they basically have a one-way or a two-way communication. So here's the important person in the middle, if you will. And here, the information is pushed out. And you can see this is going to take a while because you can see here, these people don't talk to each other. So if one person is taken into custody, that's okay. They just get a replacement, but that doesn't jeopardize any of these other people. And then here, the same thing, but it's two-way communication, meaning the head person can communicate here and then they can communicate back, but they still don't communicate or know each other. So that's the star or the hub. Now we have the wheel network. And this is a variation of the star network or the hub network, where the nodes or those people on the outside can communicate with the member to the left or right of them because of a link. Remember, we talked about the link. And this kind of quickens the pace of information sharing, but it also can expose them a little bit more. So hopefully that makes sense. So when you look at the wheel, here's the important person in the middle. So you have the two-way communication between people, but see, these people can communicate with each other. This person can communicate with these two. So there is the possibility that, this could be broken up or tapped into a little bit easier, but it also, kind of quickens the pace of information. Now, this person here can't communicate directly with this person, but again, the person to the left or the right of you or the hub. So it does speed up that information flow. And then finally, you have the all-channel network. And this is a highly decentralized network, and all nodes can basically communicate with each other and the hub. Now, this is good in the sense that it reduces feelings of isolation, it aids in collaboration and problem solving, but it's also really difficult to create, but also to maintain. So that makes it kind of difficult. And when you look at this, you'll see why. Because everybody basically can communicate with everybody. So again, it's tough to set up and difficult to control, a little bit different than kind of the wheel one. Okay, so now that we've looked at the different network communication or organizational models, if you will, let's look at the different hierarchical organizational models, meaning how are these things kind of layered? How are the organizations put together? As one person in charge or more than one, etc. So hierarchy comes from the 6th century Greek words hieros, which means sacred, and archaea, which means rule, meaning the governing of sacred things. Now, by the early 1600s, it signified the difference in rank for the Catholic clergy from the lowest parish priest to the Pope. And the hierarchical model incorporates this idea of grades of rank, if you will, or levels of rank. And it does have a couple of different characteristics, one being the principle of hierarchy. And here's where each lower organizational unit is under the direct control and supervision of a superior organizational unit. So there's kind of a hierarchy, right? And it also brings forward what's called the chain of command, which means units that are led by higher ranking authoritative figures as you ascend through the different units. And this really should be, clearly understood. So that's principle of hierarchy, and that's kind of a definition, if you will, of chain of command. So when we talk a little bit more about the organizational model itself, and kind of how they're put together, if you will. So here, the units are stacked kind of in horizontal units, if you will, with the lower ranking members, must receive and carry out orders. And here you have low flexibility, and communication can kind of get clogged a little bit. So this figure that you're looking at, that you will find on page 134 in your textbook, is kind of a simple hierarchical model with basically 3 layers. And there are more complex organizations that may have a lot more layers, making that pyramid, if you will, a lot taller. And we'll talk a little bit about tallness here in just a second. So tallness may be produced, again, by the organization growing in numbers and creating new units in which, in where you have to place them, becoming geographically dispersed, or from the need to create specialized units for, for example, snipers or hostage takers or financial experts, and even for identification forgers. And this creates the need for more hierarchy to coordinate the many parts of an organization. And there again is also an expectation that when low-ranking members of the organization receive a lawful order from a superior authority in their chain of command, if you will, that order is going to be followed. And if they don't, they're going to be disciplined. So even police departments, and I didn't throw that in there, and maybe I should, they have an organizational hierarchy. It's going to be the chief of police at the top. And then the next level might be 2 captains, and under the captains might be 4 to 6 lieutenants, etc. And it kind of goes all the way down. So, other businesses and even these terrorist organizations, they have these different types of hierarchy. Now, there's also another type of organizational model, and that's called the umbrella organizational model. So the umbrella organizational model, or UOM, has a core group that to some degree assists the groups that voluntarily associate with it. So the UOM is a relatively recent hybrid organizational structure that is made up of basically two other organizational structures, the hierarchical and the network. Different models that fall. And I'll show you a picture of one in a minute because I know it's confusing just to kind of talk about it. Now, an internal core group is at the top and provides some types of support to the organizations that are affiliated with it. And the affiliated groups are networked or tied together by continuing vertical communication from the core and by horizontal communication between the affiliated movements, etc. Now, this type of umbrella model is basically loose and decentralized in the sense that the affiliated organizations continue to have their own leaders and are to some degree autonomous. So, interesting when you kind of look at it, and here's what it looks like. So in this umbrella model, and it's another thing to kind of consider that in its beginning, Al-Qaeda was a small hierarchical organization with tight controls, but it also has evolved into kind of the umbrella model. So here you have Al-Qaeda looking at this, and you have the different pieces that fall underneath it. And then here, again, you have the different groups. So this umbrella kind of supports these groups. Does that kind of make sense? And there is some communication, but it doesn't really kind of go up and down like you saw on in some of the other different models. So this is the umbrella model. And as I said a moment ago, Al-Qaeda was a hierarchical organization, but it developed into this umbrella model. Therefore, as an umbrella model, Al-Qaeda provides, ideological encouragement, articulation, strategic goals, operational funds, logistical support, advice, and propaganda to all of those other things that fall underneath here. And you can see by looking at the umbrella. So here's, again, Al-Qaeda at the top, and here's what they're going to supply to these groups under that umbrella. So, is Al-Qaeda an operational terrorist group or just a support movement? Well, I mean, these umbrella models, they're flexible, but, different ideologies can also cause, fractures inside of those different groups. So we have to kind of keep those in mind too. Okay, so now we want to finish up with just a couple of quick things, and one is virtual organizations, or the virtual organizational model. So a virtual terrorist organization, or VTO for short, because there's a million acronyms and we have to use them all, exists in cyberspace. It really has no headquarters and needs no physical meeting space. Instead, the VTO exists in cyberspace by taking advantage of technology. Now, there is no known large terrorist group that is completely virtual. VTOs are based on cell structures. So they may be part of a large terrorist movement or be locally inspired and a little bit more independent. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, the increased reliance on information technologies by terrorist movements is to some degree caused by one, the growing number of physical safe havens for terrorists that have been disrupted or eliminated. Diplomacy, foreign aid, military weapons, training, raids, and drone attacks have all played a role in reducing the availability of physical safe havens, although they certainly haven't totally eliminated them. And then second, simultaneously, terrorist organizations have been calling for the development of autonomous terrorist cells to attack whoever they consider their enemies to be. So a VTO may be temporary, meaning gathering intelligence for a specific attack, or longer lasting and requires a high degree of trust between its members. VTO members may be dispersed geographically, but can achieve their goals by sharing their skills and knowledge collaboratively through different types of information technology. So, we've got this, we can have these virtual terrorist organizations, if you will. So now we're gonna end our lecture talking about two things, and I think I said two things a minute ago, but there's two more. So we're gonna first talk about target selection, and then we're gonna talk about suicide bombing, and then we'll be done. So target selection. So when you're a law enforcement officer like me, you look at, you think of target selection a little bit different, like this particular target, and where you want to hit, where you're going to score the most points, which would be the most vital part of an individual's body, if you will. But terrorist movements have a core set of beliefs and goals that define their ideology and basically focus their violence one way or another. Ideology identifies acceptable targets and acts as a constraint against attacking other targets. Acceptable targets serve another important purpose. In the ideological framework of terrorist movements, victims are blamed for the violence that's inflicted upon them. The essence of this argument is basically, they brought it on themselves based on what they do and what they stand for. So this construction, if you will, both relieves terrorists of their moral responsibility for the deaths that they've caused, and it glorifies them for doing so. So targets are typically selected for, different reasons. One could be for, symbolism, meaning what they stand for. One could be retaliation. Another could be to incite fear, or finally to gain support. So these are all, targets where the selection is carried out or decided upon to meet a certain goal, if you will. And then a couple of authors, Clark and Newman, have come up with a very interesting, acronym. And it's called Evil Done, two separate words, to identify the characteristics that make a target attractive to terrorists. So attractive targets are, and we're going to use this evil done. So, we look at E, exposed and publicly visible. Damage done to hidden targets really doesn't produce any visually compelling images for the news media, right? Next, vital to society's day-to-day functioning, or perhaps even survival. And these targets are the element of a country's infrastructure, things like electrical grids or pipelines or computer networks, water supply, even transportation systems. Next would be iconic or symbolic. When a picture of it is shown, many people can instantly identify it. And does that kind of make sense? Illustrations of icons in the United States include, let's say, the Statue of Liberty, the White House, the Pentagon, the Golden Gate Bridge. Global examples might be places like the Eiffel Tower, the Colosseum, or even the Taj Mahal. So these are iconic or symbolic areas or places. Number 4, legitimate, meaning that attacking them will not result in universal condemnation. So, the 9/11 attacks were condemned, but they were also widely applauded by certain groups, right? Children generally rank as the least legitimate target, but there is no ironclad protection for them. Now, Timothy McVeigh knew there was a nursery in the Oklahoma City federal building when he bombed that, but he parked a truck 8 feet under the building's door to ensure maximum destruction and lethality, and this blast killed 19 children, so he really didn't care. So this is the evil as it relates to attractive targets. And now let's do the done part. So next would be destructible, meaning targets cannot merely be damaged, because then it's looked at as like a failed attack and results in kind of a lowered opinion of a movement's capability to do what they said they were going to do. So because of that, substantial damage to a target lessens but does not eliminate this response. Next would be occupied, because mass casualties are essential to creating that continued fear factor as it relates to terrorism. So what kind of people are occupying a potential target may also be important. So you have to think about that. Next would be near. So as illustrated by the fact that let's say the IRA in Northern Ireland struck many more targets there than on British mainland. And then easy, meaning without significant and layered defense or security features. So again, Clark and Newman use this acronym EVIL DONE to identify the characteristics that make a target attractive to terrorists. Okay, so finally, as we're nearing the end, we're going to talk about suicide bombing. So suicide bombings are calculated, strategic moves to serve a specific purpose. Suicide bombers are carefully trained and undergo a long period of indoctrination, meaning, it can mean a couple of different things, but typically it's how they learn to do what they're going to do. Even to the point of a little bit of brainwashing, if you will, or manipulation. And suicide bombing attacks, they're very effective in killing and injuring people. And we've seen that just by watching the news and looking at different, bombings that have taken place around the world. So potential suicide terrorism may come from, or terrorists may come from different backgrounds. It may be different age groups, and maybe male or female. Now, most suicide terrorists believe that the act makes them a martyr and ensures them a place in their heaven. And we'll probably talk about that in some other chapters as we go on. And just to kind of give you an example of what a suicide bombing vest might look like, some of them are very crude. This is made out of kind of a heavy-duty paper, light cardboard exterior, and inside here is the shrapnel. So you have nails, you have these little ending pieces, and then you have some nuts right here. Here's your switch, here's your detonator, and you have different kinds of switch. You have a push button or a toggle, and you would wear this around your waist, and you would probably, of course, you would cover it up with a shirt, a jacket, or something like that. Another couple of crude models here is one that's made out of kind of a vinyl exterior. And when you open it up inside, you can see all of the explosive inside. And then, of course, there's going to be shrapnel built inside, and you would wear this around your waist, and you would cover it with a shirt. Another kind of an example. Now, this is a little more bulky. This would be kind of a larger one, and this is actually like a pack type device. And if you put a big sweater or a big kind of sweatshirt or hoodie or something over that, that's what it would look like. Here's one that one of my buddies made, just so you can kind of see how it looks. We thought we would try to make one, and we, of course, we had better materials, but we thought we would put one together. You can see the nuts and the pipe bombs, etc. We had a push button for the detonator, and yes, sometimes we're kind of a little bit crazy. So if you want to know what the effects of this shrapnel are, look at this individual right here that was standing fairly close to someone that detonated a suicide vest. And inside of their body, you can even tell just by the types, the circular holes, these are this was the shrapnel that was used. These are all the nuts. And you can see how many times this individual was struck throughout their entire body. Okay, some demographics on bomber folks and also attacks. Typically male, but not always. Younger, unmarried, have more than just, high school education and came from large families. Between 1981 and 2008, there were a little over 1,800 suicide bomber attacks. 20,603 people were killed and another 48,209 were wounded. So you can see the impact of these types of attacks. In 2013, research found that 40% of the population in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Palestine supported the use of suicide bombings. Women are increasingly becoming involved in terrorist tactical roles, suicide bombing as well. And studying suicide bombers is difficult, however, because of their true motives or their reasons of suicide bombers are unknown, because usually they're killed when that bomb detonates. So a lot of times you can only interview the family members, and they're not really going to give you maybe the correct information. Now, there are some videotapes that I believe I've put in this presentation and in others that talk to individuals that either they were going to use a suicide bombing attack, but it failed, or they haven't quite done it yet, but they're on the verge of doing it, and they're explaining to you why they're going to do it. So a couple of interesting videos to take a look at. And here again are some requirements, if you will, of the handlers of suicide bombers and the bombers themselves. So the handler is the person that's going to kind of take care of you. So they're going to be responsible for this: the safe house operation, the maintaining secrecy, making sure they have skilled personnel to, do all of these things here. They're in charge of selecting the bomber, doing the reconnaissance, and then, the bomber themselves, again, being able to conceal the explosives, having a means to detonate it, unless walking, a means to get to the target. How are they going to communicate with the handler, making sure they're getting to the right place, etc. So, here's again, handler requirements, bombing requirements. So how then, and we're just about wrapped up, do terrorist organizations end? Do they just stop, or does something else happen in order to kind of make this happen, if you will? Well, in America, the failure rate for new small business is 50 to 70% in the first 18 months. That's a lot. So, 90% of all terrorist groups don't survive their first year. New terrorist groups have risks in recruiting, because it's typically done face-to-face, although some is done, over the internet. So you've got these two different things. Typically, it's going to start face-to-face, but they have established groups to recruit over the internet. Now, terrorist organizations or these movements appear to be, at risk of failure due to a couple of different things. First would be inexperience. Second would be bad operational decisions. So maybe they're not making the right decisions, etc. Lack of capital, meaning money, in order to maybe provide some inducement, etc. And then finally would be the environment, where they're at and what type of environment are they working in. Now, terrorist organizations end in 6 different ways. So again, just kind of making sure that we're on, here we talk about they're at risk of failure due to these 4 things. Well, here the groups actually end in 6 different ways. The first is the group leader is captured or killed. And this is actually referred to as decapitation. That's the strategy. And its results are a little bit inconsistent. Capturing terrorist leaders is a better option than killing them because the leaders are cut off from the group. The group may be kind of in turmoil while deciding what to do about their leadership. This is kind of one of the reasons. Next, the group might enter into negotiations. So, all democracies publicly maintain that they do not negotiate with terrorists, but sometimes they do in secret. Before agreeing to, go to the table, governments must conclude what prospects there are for a reasonable, outcome when you're dealing with terrorists, etc. Next would be that the group's aims are achieved. So they actually did what they were going to do. They were successful. So, as the saying goes, the devil's always in the details. For example, it may have, accepted concessions, granting it that it may have been impossible to achieve. But again, if the aim of the group is achieved, then that could be one reason that an organization could in fact end. Next, implosion or loss of the group's public support. So sometimes the terrorist movements end because the group eventually just disintegrates. A significant factor in this is the loss of support. For example, the ideology, let's say, loses its relevancy. The group kind of loses the understanding about what the actual group's end game is, etc. Next would be the group is defeated by force. So the application of military force accounts for about 7% of the defeats of terrorist groups. And then finally, a transition by the group from terrorism into different forms of violence. Most commonly, terrorist groups shift from to criminal acts, which implies a shift away from political or religious goals and more towards acquiring goods and profits. So they're kind of in it for themselves, if you will. So again, what happens to the military arms and supplies when these groups kind of go away? What happens to the terrorist fighters? So those are kind of two important questions when you talk about how terrorist organizations end. Well, if the terrorists win, there really is no issue. But if defeated by force or the group's aims are achieved, how much certainty can there be that all the arms have been collected or otherwise accounted for? And again, do they just go join another cause? Do they start a new one elsewhere? How does that, does life just go on, or do they just go off to live a life of peace? I mean, these are all different kinds of questions. Audrey Cronin actually writes a pretty interesting book on how terrorism ends, and it talks about understanding the decline or the demise of different terrorist groups. Okay, so a lot of information that we covered. So I appreciate you hanging in there with me. This will conclude part 2 of our Chapter 5 lecture on terrorist organizations and structures.